In this video, we'll be placing beams in Revit Structure. To draw these beams, we need to select the beam tool while in any model view. In this case, we'll come into our second floor view and then start to zoom in just a little bit so that we can see where each of our column locations are at. Next, we're going to need to come up here underneath the Structure tab and then select on Beam. Now, the kind of beam that we're going to need to have in this case is going to be a W21 by 57. So that happens to be a specific steel shape and size. Now, if we look here on our list, we can see that all we have loaded in here are W8 by 10s through a W16 by 26. What that means is that none of them are quite large enough for the kind of building that we're building. So what we're going to need to do is come in and actually load in another beam size. So up here, there's this option for Load Family. Now go ahead and select on Load Family. Next, this is going to be a structural beam, so we need to look for the word structural. Now there's no category here that just says beams, but what this is going to be structural framing. So go into there. There's an option there for steel. Then down toward the very bottom, there's a W wide flange, and that's what we want. So go ahead and highlight on that and click on Open. Once you do that, it's going to bring up a list of all the different W shapes that we could load into our project. In this case, once again, we want to do a W21 by 57. So we're just going to find that on the list by scrolling down or clicking. And here we have our W21 by 57. Now, if you select on it in order to be able to highlight that row, you can then click on OK, and that will load that into your project. Now, if you get this message that says family already exists, that's partially true. What it really means is that there's already a W family loaded into the project. Do you want to add that extra size to it? And in this case, yes, you do. So just say override the existing version, and it'll go ahead and add that extra size into your project. Now, if we look here on the list, we're going to find a W21 by 57, the one we just loaded in. So go ahead and select on that. Now, if you want to be able to draw these in, well, we can do it individually first, and that's pretty easy just by zooming in, picking a point. In this case, it's the intersection of A and 1, and then picking another point over here. And you'll notice that by default, it's coming in as just a single line. If we do this again, it'll show up as just a single line again. Now, this is the way it's supposed to display in this kind of view. Now, when I say that, it really means that this is the way it's supposed to display in this detail level. In this case, we have a detail level being coarse. But if we change this to be a detail level of being fine, we can then see it having each little layer of material, each thickness showing up here. So if we decide to draw another one, this time we're going to see all the lines and the appropriate thickness, just like if we were looking at it from above. But one thing that we could do is we could continue on drawing in between each of these, sort of playing connect the dots if we wanted to. But there is a faster way to go about doing this. And the faster way is to move up here to where it has On Grids and select On Grids. Next, move your mouse over here, sort of between the 5 and the 6, and then click and hold your mouse button down. And then just create a window going around all these different things. Now what this is going to do is it's going to select the structural grid, and it's going to place this kind of beam along the structural grid. And all you have to do at this point is just click on this big green check mark here that says Finish. And now we have those beams in all these different locations. Now, one beam that you may have gotten is this one right here. We don't really want it. So if you end up getting an extra beam here or here, feel free to just escape out and just select on the beam and then hit the Delete key on the keyboard, or right-click and then go down here to Delete and say Delete. And it'll just get rid of the extra beams that we don't need. Now we can go ahead and take a look at this in the 3D view so we have a better idea of what it is that we've done so far. Right, so this is what our condition currently is. Now, the next thing we need to do is be able to bring these exact same shapes and sizes all the way on up to the top of our building. So in order to be able to accomplish that, we're going to go back to our plan view, and you can either do that by double-clicking here on second floor or just closing this window down. And if you move your mouse down here to near where this D is at, don't actually click on anything, but just sort of click in space, hold your mouse button down, and just window around all these different entities that are here. Let go of the button, everything will turn blue. Now this is a little bit more than what we really wanted to be able to select. So we can come up here to this thing that says a filter. It kind of looks like a funnel. And if you click on the filter, what we want to be able to select here is that we're going to select our structural framing. So you can clear out structural columns because they already exist, as well as just the regular columns. Those are the architectural columns. And we can click on OK. Now the only thing that are currently selected are those different beams that we just placed. Now that we've done that, we can come up here to the copy command, and it's not this copy command. You have to pick this copy command, which is the copy to clipboard. Once you've done that, you can click on the word paste. Be sure to click on the word and select on align to selected levels. What this is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to choose which levels we want to have this structural information brought up to. In this case, we want it to be brought up all the way up to the roof. So just highlight everything from the third floor down the roof. And you can do that by selecting on third floor, holding down your shift key, and then picking on roof. Next, click on OK. Now it might take you a few seconds here, but once it finishes processing, feel free to come up here to the 3D view and click on that. And what you'll see is that it's copied that up level by level all the way up to the roof level. So in conclusion, to place your perimeter beams, you just need to leverage the beam tool up here on the ribbon and select the grids or points where you want to place your beams. A beam system is a group of beams spaced evenly, usually inside of a structural bay, and that holds something up above. To draw these beams, we need to execute the beam system command underneath the structure tab. So go ahead and select on beam system. Now, for this particular building, we're going to need to adjust a few different properties here. The first thing is we want to have beams of a certain size. In order to be able to adjust the size of the beams that are getting ready to be placed, here on the options bar, it says beam type. Right now it says W21 by 57. I'm going to go ahead and select on that. And the kind that we want to place in here will be a W14 by 30. So let's just look for that on the list, find it, and then just select on that. Now the justification being center is just fine. What that means is how do we want these to be spaced from the beginning? Do we want it to be centered in the bay, or do we want it to be based at wherever the end of the bay or the back of the bay is going to be at? Center is just fine in this case. This is the distance apart that each of the beams need to be spaced. And in this case, 6 feet is what we want, so we can be fine with that. But one thing that we do want to do, though, is we're going to change this from being a fixed distance to be what's called clear spacing. So it's just going to try to space these evenly inside of here. And you can see if I move my mouse in here, you can start to see some of these dashed lines showing up inside of the bay. Now, one thing that I did do, and this was a mistake on my part, is I just typed in 6, and then I believe I actually put the inch sign after it, because right now we're seeing them spaced every 6 inches maybe, or maybe that's what it was by default. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this to be 6 feet instead of 6 inches, because that just would have been obviously way too close. And then by moving the mouse back down again, you can see that there's a dashed lines in there indicating where those beams are going to get placed. Also, before I click in there, I'll go ahead and point out the fact that I could change all that information as well underneath the properties over here. So you can either choose it here, or else you can choose up here in order to be able to make your changes. All that being said, we have everything set up the way that we want. Now we can go ahead and just move our mouse inside of here. I want this to go from left to right, not up and down. So come up here to the top of the bay, and now you can see the dashed lines going from left to right. And then just click on the inside there. And continue to do this, going across. Unfortunately, there's not really a faster way to do this, but really this isn't very long. We're going to be talking about perhaps 12 clicks by the time this is all said and done. Now that we've done that, we can see right now it's just single line symbology. If we wanted to have this be 2 lines, show what the actual thickness of the beams are, we could always come down here to our detail level and change it from a coarse level of detail up to a fine level of detail and be able to see each of those beams in this case. Just so that you can see it, let's go ahead and take a look at this in a 3D view. Zoom in a little bit here. We can see how they're going to look when placed. I'm going to come up here one more time, click on the big X, And I'm going to click on the big green check mark here. If you ever get this error message that says it hasn't been specified, what it really means is that you're in the middle of the command and you just need to cancel out of the command, and that's okay. So we'll just click on quit sketching here, and that'll get us out of the command. The last thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to copy this up so these same conditions are in each of the structural bays going all the way on up the building. So in order to be able to do that, we'll just come down here to near where the D is at. We're going to click, window around, and now we're going to come back up to this filter tool again, select on filter, and what we're going to want to bring up is going to be that structural beam system. So we can clear out everything but the structural beam system. Click on OK to that. Next, we're going to come up here to copy the clipboard. Then we're going to select on the word paste, and we're going to align that to our selected levels. In this case, it means that we're going to copy this from the 3rd floor all the way up to the roof level. Now we'll wait for a few seconds for this to process. Now the purpose of these going across the building will be to support our floors up above, as well as up on the roof level to be able to help support the roof. Now once it's finished processing, feel free to go ahead and go to your 3D view and take a look at it. And you can spin the model around either by selecting up here somewhere on the view cube, or else by just holding down Shift and the button on your wheel mouse. Adding beams to a structural bay is easy to accomplish. We just need to choose the appropriate beam and its properties and specify where we would like to place it. One of the fastest things we can do is label our beam systems. In order to do this, first you should always be inside of a plan view. Next, we'll go ahead and zoom in just a little bit so we can actually read some of the text. And then we'll come up here to the Annotate tab on our ribbon. Now, once you select on Annotate, there's a big button over here that says Tag All. Go ahead and select on Tag All. Now there's going to be a big long list of things here, and we're going to have to look for a tag that's going to allow us to tag these individual things. And in this case, it's going to be a structural framing tag, and we're just going to use the standard structural framing tag. So you can just highlight that. Now what each of these actually are is that they're each tags for different kinds of objects. If they have multiple different kinds of conditions here, where it says loaded tags, what it's giving you is different looks to the tag, so you can just choose which kind of look that you want to have associated with that particular tag. This one that we're choosing here is just going to have the steel size associated with it. So we'll go ahead and click on OK to that. And as you can see, of all these structural members we had in this view, they now all have a size tag to them. If one of these members would happen to change to be something of a different size, for instance, like in this case, I'm going to click on this 14 by 30. I'm going to select on the little pin head here and just unpin it. That's going to allow us to change it. And if I change this to be a different size, perhaps 12 by 26, we'll see the tag automatically update on the fly. And let's go ahead and change that back to a 14 by 30. And once again, you can see it automatically update itself on the fly. One thing to know, though, is if we would go to our 3rd floor, those tags are not there, so you'll need to use that command again on each of your subsequent floors. So labeling our beam systems is easy. All you need to do is come up here and select on Tag All, or your other option will be to select on Tag by Category. What this will allow you to do is label each of these individual beams on an individual basis. Adding coping to a beam changes the shape of the beam to be able to make a connection with another beam. In order to be able to do this in Revit, let's go ahead and move to our Level 2 structural plan so that we can draw a beam in. Now, I'm going to zoom in here to this left-hand structural bay. Next, move up here to where we have the structure and beam and select on that. Now we want to change this from being this HSS size to being a different shape. The size that we really want is going to be a W12 by 26. So go ahead and select on that. Next, we're going to need to start to draw this in. Now this level 2 is just fine. So we'll move our mouse down. And then when you see this triangular shape, when you're hovering over the beam over here on the left-hand side, go ahead and click, go straight across. And then when you see that triangular shape again, go ahead and click again. And that's going to automatically drop a beam in right in the middle of this bay. You can escape a couple of times to get out of the command. Then move your mouse back over, highlight the beam, and click on it. What we're going to need to do is that right now this beam is at the same elevation as all the rest of them. So there's really not much from a structural point of view how this really needs to be able to change. I mean, it's just going to kind of be flush right now. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to drop this beam down so that we can cut a little chunk out of it and have this beam sit on these other two beams right here. So in order to be able to do that, we'll come over here where it has a start level offset and an end level offset. And we're just going to change this to be -6 inches for both of them. So change that -6 inches, this be -6 inches. Essentially, it's going to drop this and this point down to -6 inches, so 6 inches lower than where it was. You can then just sort of click out in space in order to get out of the selection. Now let's take a look at this in a 3D view. We can see how it's 6 inches lower than these other beams have been. And this was the elevation that it was at before we dropped it. So now we need to go ahead and use the coping tool in order to be able to cut a little chunk out of this end as well as the other end, so that this beam can just sit right along here. So to begin with, select on one of the beams, it doesn't really matter which one, then pick on the word cope up here. Once you've done that, you'll need to select on this one first. This is going to be the one we're going to be cutting the material out first. And now select on this beam over here. See how it's cut the material out of it? In fact, if we hit escape a couple times to get out of the command, select on the beam, we can then look over here, move down a little bit, and we can see that there's actually a coping distance parameter that shows up here. Well, if we change this coping distance parameter to be perhaps 3 inches instead and click on apply, see how it gets that much bigger? What it's doing is instead of just putting a little bit of a 1-inch gap between this beam and this, it's now making it be a 3-inch gap. If we want to be able to change that back, we can just make that be 1 inches again, click on apply, and you can see how that coping area is now quite a bit smaller. Now let's go ahead and add that down here to the other end. One thing that you could do, particularly if this beam is already highlighted, is you can just click on this little corner up here, the view cube, and it'll automatically just spin everything around, and it'll keep this beam centered in your picture. Now we can quickly zoom in here, take a look at our current condition. We can select on the beam. Then we'll go ahead and use the coping tool. Select on this one first, then this one, and we can see it's automatically cut that material out for us. So to wrap it up, the coping tool automates the process of being able to add coping to the end of a beam. The Edit Beam Joins tool adjusts how beams interface with one another. So let's create a condition where our steel members become flush with each other at their ends. Now, in order to be able to do this, let's go ahead and move to our Level 2 structural plan. And we'll go ahead and zoom in here on our left-hand side. Now, technically, these are kind of flush with one another, and that's an okay thing. But what I'd really like them to do is come together at an angle right here. Now, in order to be able to achieve that, first thing we need to do is be able to select on one of these beams. Once we do that, we'll get the Beam Joins tool available to us. And that shows up here. Oftentimes, it's just this little tiny little icon. It looks like two beams sort of coming together. And you can see by the little preview button here kind of what it does. But if we select on this Beam Joins tool, we'll then get these little arrows that show up. Now, if you select on one arrow, it'll sort of bring one back. If we select on another arrow, it'll bring them forward. Now, if I click on this arrow again, you notice how if they're sort of going apart from one another, pointing away from each other, it's allowing them to clean up and they're coming together at a 45-degree angle. And this is how I want these to clean up in this particular condition. So let's go ahead and take a look at that and try to do that here on the other end. Here I have one arrow that's sort of going in this direction. Now, ideally, I'd like to have this arrow pointing opposite from it. And you can see when they're pointing opposite directions from one another, it automatically cleans up to this intersection. So let's go ahead and do that for the next two. Always helps to try to click on the right arrow. And if you can get them actually pointing away from each other, or in this case, they kind of flipped it and they're pointing in, but it'll end up getting that 45-degree angle there, and will give you the kind of cleanup that you're looking for. So the point of the beam joints tool is that it's going to allow you to adjust the way two beams clean up with one another. Our next goal is to learn how to put joists into our structure. In reality, a joist is really no more than a beam. And the placement of this is really going to be almost identical to how we placed our beams in. One of the things that I find that people tend to do is when they first think about using joists, they'll come up here and try to use the truss tool instead of actually doing a joist. And that's really a mistake. The truss tool will put these absolutely massive trusses going across your building with these incredibly strong structural shapes. And it's not really what you want to use. In reality, whenever we're going to be placing a joist in, all it really is a beam. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and move into our level 2 floor plan. Then we're going to move over here to the right-hand side. And once again, we're going to come up here and select on beam system. Right now, it's given us a listing of this 14K6, and that's probably going to be the right size for us. And what this 14K6 actually is, it happens to be a joist shape. Now, if you wanted to be able to add in different sort of shapes and sizes, that sort of thing, this is essentially just a beam at this point, and you just have to load a beam into your project by coming in here to Structure and Beam, and then loading in a beam family, and then you'd be able to find it underneath your structural beams, just like the rest of the beams are located at. Now, let me go ahead and start to drop these joists in. And there is one key thing to remember when we're going to be dropping the joists in, which is going to be slightly different than our beams. So we'll come up here to Structure. Once again, we'll just do a beam system. This 14K6, which is already loaded into the project, is just perfect for what we want to do. The fixed distance is fine, of 6 feet. The justification I like. So we'll just go ahead and move our mouse here into the inside. We can see some dashed lines that are going across. This is the direction I want it to go. I will point out that if you move over to the left side or to the right side, it's going to go up and down. But in this case, I'd rather it expand in this direction. So go ahead and just pick up here toward the top and click. And it'll go ahead and drop those joists into the project. Now, if we take a look at this in a 3D view now, we can kind of zoom in here, and it's a little bit difficult to see, but what's going on here is that the top of the joist are actually flush with the top of the beams. And how joists work is we really want to have the joist sitting on top of the beams because the beams are what are going to be supporting those joists. And this is what's slightly different from what we did before whenever we were talking about beams. What we're going to need to do is just come up here to the big green check mark in order to finish the command that we've been activating. If it says quit sketch, just hit quit sketch, all right? You should have a screen that looks like this. Once you get to this point, move your mouse until you see the dashed lines show up. And you could do this in a plan view as well if you wished. When you see those dashed lines, just click. They'll highlight in a darker blue or a purplish color. And then the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to offset this a certain height. In this case, let's just go ahead and offset this off the level 2.5 inches. This is going to raise these joists up high enough that they're going to actually be sitting on top of the beams instead of dying into the beams. And we'll click on Apply. Joists are used to span large distances in Revit structure and can be placed very much like beams inside of the software. Our next step is to add cross bracing for extra support in our structure. To accomplish this, we need to use our bracing tools, which show up here underneath the Structure tab. So go ahead and come up here and select on Brace. Once you've done that, you'll see that we have different kinds of steel, metal shapes over here on our type selector list. What probably came up as being the default, which is this HSS 6x6, that's probably the one that we'll want to use. So let's go ahead and just select on that. Next, and this is probably the critical part, we need to be able to select on the correct points when placing this cross bracing. In fact, I would say from my own personal experience, this has been one of the most difficult things to learn about Revit structure, is where to click in order to be able to place these cross bracings. Now, what I like to do is come in here, and then if I want to cross brace, it comes from this intersection up to kind of up toward the middle here. I like to move down here, and what you'll be very tempted to do will be to click right here or maybe click right here. But the best place to click is going to be up here, right about here, sort of in the middle where this blue dashed line or this blue line ends up showing up, and that little purple box shows up. So go ahead and just select right there, come up here, and then kind of pick right in the middle of this particular beam that shows up here. And then click. And now you can see how that cross bracing piece is coming up and it's sort of tying in and right the location where you're going to want it to be at. If we tried clicking down here or up here or in any other location that wasn't kind of in the center of where these beams are currently located at, it would put this cross bracing in at an odd angle or crossed over where this beam was at, and it just wouldn't have cleaned up right inside of the software. So let's go ahead and do that again over here on the right-hand side. Move over, click where this little box shows up right here, which is lined up with the middle of this beam, and then come up here where you see the little triangle, which is the midpoint of that beam. Go ahead and click. And you can see how it automatically puts the cross bracing in and cleans it up so it happens to be the appropriate length. Cross bracing is perhaps most easily added in framing elevations. The process of creating the bracing is easy enough. We execute the command and then tell Revit the locations we would like the beams to join to, and then Revit does the rest.